For the third time that week, Clara Hawkins found her stallion Midnight standing at the exact same spot overlooking Serpent Canyon, his ears pricked forward and muscles tense as if listening to something only he could hear. When she finally climbed down to investigate, what she discovered made her knees buckle. Clara Hawkins gripped the leather reins tighter as Midnight picked his way down the treacherous canyon path with the sure footing of a horse who knew every stone and crevice by heart. The third time in a week her stallion had brought her here without prompting, and she could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Serpent Canyon stretched before them in layers of red and orange rock that caught the late afternoon sun like burnished copper, while shadows pooled in the depths below, creating pockets of mystery that had swallowed more than one careless traveller over the years. Midnight stopped at the exact same outcropping as before, and his ears swiveled forward with an intensity that made the fine hairs on Clara's neck rise as she watched him focus on something only he could perceive in the maze of stone below. She dismounted slowly, and her boots scraped against loose shale that tumbled down the slope in a cascade of sound that echoed off the canyon walls before fading into silence. The air hung still and heavy with the scent of sage and sun-baked earth, while Midnight remained frozen in place like a sentry keeping watch over secrets hidden in the ancient rocks. Clara followed his gaze to a narrow ledge about 30 feet below where a strange shadow suggested an opening in the cliff face that she had never noticed in all her years of riding this territory. Something pulled at her consciousness and urged her forward despite every instinct that warned against descending into unknown spaces where rattlesnakes and worse things made their homes. She secured Midnight's reins to a sturdy juniper and began the careful climb down, using handholds carved by wind and time, while her heart hammered against her ribs with each precarious step. The ledge proved wider than it appeared from above and led to a natural alcove protected by an overhang of red rock that created a hidden sanctuary invisible from the canyon rim. Fresh wildflowers lay carefully arranged near a wooden marker, and their bright yellow petals seemed impossible in this harsh landscape where water was scarce and life struggled for every drop. Clara's knees buckled as she read the name carved into the weathered wood with strokes that spoke of patient devotion and endless grief. Emma Hawkins, her sister's name, etched deep enough to last decades, while the wood itself showed signs of regular maintenance and care that meant someone visited this remote grave with dedication that defied understanding. 7 years had passed since the Apache raid that took Emma during a gathering trip to the canyon, and every search party had returned empty-handed, with reports of no trace found among the scattered rocks and endless ravines. Clara reached out with trembling fingers to touch the marker, and felt the smooth grain where loving hands had worn away the roughness through repeated caresses. The flowers were fresh and no more than a day old, which meant someone had been here recently to tend this hidden memorial, and the thought sent ice through her veins as she realized the magnitude of deception that surrounded her sister's fate. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The worn path beckoned Clara deeper into the canyon where ancient water had carved passages through solid rock, creating a labyrinth that seemed designed by nature to hide secrets from prying eyes. Her boots found purchase on stones worn smooth by countless feet over unknown years, and the realization that someone had travelled this route regularly sent shivers through her body despite the lingering warmth trapped between the canyon walls. Around a sharp bend where the passage narrowed to barely allow a person through, she discovered the first undeniable proof that someone lived in this remote place, and her breath caught in her throat at the implications. 3 water barrels sat tucked beneath an overhang and covered with brush so carefully arranged that she would have missed them entirely, if not for the slight gleam of metal where the camouflage had shifted. Fresh water in the desert meant life, and whoever maintained these barrels had invested considerable effort in creating a sustainable refuge far from civilization and its accompanying dangers. Further exploration revealed food caches wrapped in oilcloth and stored in natural cavities where cool air preserved their contents from the harsh elements that could spoil provisions in hours during summer months. Dried meat and hardtack biscuits spoke of practical survival, while small luxuries like preserved peaches and honey suggested someone who maintained hope for more than mere existence in this hidden sanctuary. Midnight followed her through the passages with complete confidence, and his hooves rang against stone in familiar rhythms that told Clara he had walked this path many times before her discovery today. The stallion paused at certain points to drink from a concealed spring, or investigate specific crevices with the comfortable manner of an animal returning to known territory rather than exploring new ground. His calm demeanour stood in stark contrast to Clara's racing heart as she pieced together evidence that pointed toward an impossible conclusion that threatened to upend 7 years of accepted truth about her sister's fate. Could Emma have survived the raid that everyone assumed had claimed her life along with 2 other women from their settlement who were never found among the bodies left behind by the Apache war party? The possibility sent Clara's emotions careening between desperate hope that her beloved sister might yet live and paralysing fear of what circumstances could have kept Emma hidden all these years when her family mourned her as dead. Each new discovery raised more questions than answers and created a picture of deliberate concealment that spoke of danger or shame or circumstances too complex for simple explanations. The failing light forced Clara to abandon her exploration, but her mind was already racing ahead to dawn when she would return better prepared for whatever truth awaited in these hidden passages. She would bring her father's army pistol that hung above the mantel at home, along with supplies that might be welcomed by someone living in secret or serve as peace offerings if the inhabitant proved hostile to intrusion. The climb back to midnight seemed to take forever, as her trembling legs struggled with holds that had seemed solid on the descent, while her thoughts churned with possibilities that ranged from joyous reunion to dangerous confrontation with unknown inhabitants of this canyon refuge. Dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold as Clara descended the now familiar path with saddlebags heavy with supplies and her father's army colt weighing down her right hip with its unfamiliar presence. The morning air carried a chill that would burn away within hours, but for now, it sharpened her senses and made every sound seem amplified in the cathedral silence of the ancient rocks. She had barely reached the hidden alcove when that unmistakable prickling sensation crawled across her skin teeth and like invisible fingers tracing her spine and warning her of unseen eyes that watched her every movement from somewhere among the towering stone formations above. Years of frontier living had taught her to trust this primitive instinct that had saved more lives than any weapon, and she forced herself to continue forward with deliberate calm while her peripheral vision scanned for any sign of the watcher. Movement caught her eye among the higher rocks where shadows still pooled deep and black against the brightening sky, and for just a heartbeat she glimpsed a figure in traditional Apache dress before it melted back into the darkness with the fluid grace of someone born to these wild places. The brief image burned into her memory showed decorated leather and long black hair adorned with feathers that marked this as no casual traveller, but someone who belonged to the old ways that her people had tried so hard to erase from this territory. Clara's heart hammered as she stood in the centre of the alcove and drew a deep breath before calling out the name that had haunted her dreams for 7 long years. Emma's name echoed off the canyon walls and returned to her distorted and strange as if the rocks themselves were mocking her desperate hope with twisted versions of her own voice that sounded more like sobbing than calling. The echoes faded into silence, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling high above, and Clara felt the weight of watching eyes grow heavier, though no further movement betrayed the observer's position among the ancient stones. Midnight stood patient and calm throughout the entire exchange, and his lack of concern suggested familiarity with whoever watched from the shadows, which only deepened the mystery of his repeated journeys to this hidden place. Clara unpacked the supplies she had brought, including dried beef and canned peaches along with medical supplies and warm blankets that might ease the life of someone forced to exist in these harsh conditions far from the comforts of civilization. From the inner pocket of her coat she withdrew the most precious item of all, and her fingers trembled as she smoothed the blue silk ribbon that had once adorned Emma's golden hair during happier times before violence tore their family apart. She placed the ribbon carefully beside the grave marker, where it caught the morning breeze and fluttered like a tiny flag of memory and hope against the red stone. While tears she had held back for 7 years finally escaped to trace silent paths down her weather-bronzed cheeks, the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the canyon made Clara spin around with her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at her hip as she recognized the distinctive gait of Jacob Thornton's blood bay gelding approaching down the narrow trail. Her neighbour sat tall in the saddle with the confident bearing of a man who believed his presence was both welcome and necessary wherever he chose to appear, and his thin lips curved in what he probably thought was a friendly smile, but looked more like a snake preparing to strike. Clara felt her stomach tighten as she realized he must have followed her from the ranch at first light and waited until she was deep in the canyon before making his approach where no one could witness whatever conversation he had planned. Jacob dismounted with deliberate slowness and tied his horse near Midnight, who shifted uneasily at the presence of the other animal, before settling under Clara's calming hand on his neck. The man's pale eyes swept over the supplies she had brought and lingered on the hidden alcove with its carefully maintained grave marker before returning to her face with an expression of false concern that made her skin crawl. "Clara, my dear, I must confess to some worry about your recent behaviour," he began in that patronising tone she had endured at countless town meetings, where he tried to position himself as a voice of wisdom and authority. "Several of our neighbours have noticed your daily rides toward Apache territory, and there's growing concern about a woman alone venturing into such dangerous areas without proper escort or protection." The words dripped with implied threat wrapped in social propriety, and Clara recognised the opening moves of a campaign to undermine her standing in the community by questioning her judgment and perhaps even her sanity. She had seen Jacob employ the similar tactics against the widow Martinez, whose prime grazing land he had acquired after spreading rumours about her inability to manage property without a man's guidance. "Your concern is touching but unnecessary, Jacob," she replied, while keeping her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest at his transparent manipulation. "I've been riding these canyons since childhood, and I'm perfectly capable of assessing any dangers without your assistance, or that of the town gossips who seem to have nothing better to do than watch my movements." His face darkened at her dismissive tone, and the mask of concern slipped enough to reveal the calculating greed beneath as he stepped closer with his hand resting casually on his own sidearm. "A woman alone visiting savage territories where good Christian folk were massacred not so long ago? Well, people will talk, Clara, and questions will be raised about whether someone who takes such risks is fit to manage valuable property with water rights that affect the whole valley." The threat hung between them as naked as a drawn blade, and Clara understood with crystal clarity that Jacob would use her canyon visits to build a case for her mental instability if she didn't cease them immediately. Without hesitation, she drew her father's pistol and held it steady between them, while her voice carried the iron determination that had kept her ranch running through drought and hardship when weaker souls had given up and sold out to men like Jacob Thornton. The creak of a floorboard pulled Clara from restless dreams filled with the canyon shadows, and watching eyes into the fuller alertness that frontier life demanded, when unexpected sounds broke the night's rhythm. Moonlight streamed through her cabin window and illuminated a figure standing perfectly still beside her bed. And Clara's hand moved toward the pistol beneath her pillow, before stopping as she recognized the traditional Apache dress and patient stance of someone who meant no immediate harm. The woman appeared to be in her middle years with silver threading through black hair worn in traditional braids, and her weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen both joy and sorrow in equal measure. Clara sat up slowly while keeping her movements deliberate and unthreatening as she had learned that sudden gestures could transform peaceful encounters into violence, faster than thought. The woman stepped into the moonlight and spoke in careful broken English that carried urgency despite the language barrier between them. "My name's Singing Bird, and I come with message from one you seek in Canyon," she said, while her dark eyes studied Clara's face for signs of understanding. "Your sister, she lives and has sent me to speak truth you deserve after many seasons of sorrow." The words hit Clara like a physical blow that drove the air from her lungs and left her gasping as 7 years of accepted grief crumbled in an instant. Singing Bird continued with patient determination to explain what had become of Emma Hawkins after the raid that had supposedly claimed her life, along with the 2 other women from the settlement. "Your sister badly hurt when warriors find her in Canyon Rocks, where she fell trying to escape on foot after her horse was killed beneath her. My people take her to our camp where medicine women work many days to heal wounds that would have killed her without proper care. Emma's body healed slowly over many moons, but her spirit found peace among people who accepted her without questions about her past or demands for her future beyond contributing to the band's survival. When time came that she could travel again, she chose to remain with those who had saved her and shown her kindness when her own people would have left her to die, rather than risk Apache territory for rescue. She take husband from our warriors and bear 2 children who bring joy to her heart and give purpose to her days in ways she never knew among white settlements." Singing Bird explained that Emma had wanted to send word, but feared it would bring soldiers or vengeful settlers who would destroy the fragile peace her adopted band had found in remote canyons. "Your sister sent Horse Midnight as messenger, hoping you would understand and follow where he led to learn truth without endangering others who done no wrong except show mercy to injured women." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as joy at Emma's survival warred with hurt and anger that her sister had chosen to let family grieve rather than risk exposure of her new life among people their society deemed enemies. The morning after Singing Bird's visit brought consequences as swift and merciless as Clara had feared when she discovered that Jacob Thornton had wasted no time spreading his poison throughout the settlement. The general store buzzed with whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when she entered to purchase supplies, and faces that had shown her neighbourly warmth for years now turned cold with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. "Mrs. Secrum." Henderson pulled her daughter away when Clara approached, and muttered something about Apache lovers that carried clearly in the sudden silence, while other women gathered their skirts aside as if her presence might contaminate them with whatever madness drove her to visit savage territories. Sheriff Patterson found Clara at the livery stable where she was checking Midnight's shoes and preparing for another journey that now seemed more urgent than ever given the hostile atmosphere spreading through town like wildfire. "Clara, I need to speak with you privately," the sheriff said, while glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard by the stable hands who were finding excuses to work nearby. "Jacob Thornton's been holding meetings and stirring folks up about your daily rides toward the canyon, and there's talk of forming a vigilante committee to clean out any Apache presence in the area before they can raid our settlements again." The sheriff was a decent man who had always treated Clara fairly, but she could see the strain in his weathered face as he tried to balance his duty to uphold law with the growing mob sentiment that threatened to overwhelm reason. "I can't stop citizens from riding where they please, but I'm warning you that visiting that canyon now could be seen as provocation and might give Thornton the excuse he needs to question your judgment officially." Clara thanked him for the warning, but they both knew that mob justice rarely waited for official proceedings when fear and hatred reached the boiling point that Thornton was deliberately stoking. That afternoon brought visits from her few remaining friends, including Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, who had always shown kindness despite their different social positions. "My dear Clara, you must cease these dangerous rides immediately," she pleaded, while wringing her hands in genuine distress. "People are saying terrible things about you consorting with savages, and some are even suggesting you've lost your reason from grief over Emma, and might need to be placed under protective custody for your own safety." The fear in her friend's eyes told Clara more than their words about how quickly Thornton's campaign was succeeding in isolating her from any support within the community. She faced an impossible choice between abandoning her newly discovered connection to Emma and the truth about her sister's fate, or risking everything she had built through years of hard work and careful management of her ranch. As darkness fell, Clara made her decision with the same determination that had kept her going through drought and loss and the endless challenges of frontier life. She loaded Midnight's saddlebags with medical supplies and food while keeping watch for any sign of observers who might report her movements to Thornton's growing band of vigilantes who saw Apache threats in every shadow and justified their hatred with memories of old wounds that time had failed to heal. Singing Bird led Clara through twisting canyon passages that narrowed and widened like the breathing of some massive stone creature, until they emerged in a hidden valley where an Apache camp nestled beside a spring-fed pool surrounded by cottonwoods that provided precious shade. The sight of cook fires and traditional wickiups made from bent branches and brush seemed like stepping into another world entirely separate from the settlements and ranches that Clara had known all her life. Children played beside the water while women worked at various tasks and warriors kept watch from strategic positions along the valley walls, though they made no threatening moves toward Clara, who was clearly expected. A woman rose from beside one of the fires and turned toward them with movements that Clara would have recognized anywhere, despite the changes that 7 years had wrought on the familiar figure. Emma's face bore scars that traced pale lines across her left cheek and forehead, where Apache weapons had marked her during those terrible moments of the raid before her eventual rescuers had found her broken among the rocks. 2 children clung to her doeskin skirts, with the natural shyness of young ones confronting a stranger, though their wide, curious eyes studied Clara with intelligence that reminded her painfully of Emma at that age. The little girl appeared to be perhaps 5 years old, with her mother's golden hair darkened by her father's heritage, while the boy of maybe 3 had the sturdy build that promised future strength. "I couldn't come back." "Clara, not like this, and not with them," Emma said softly, while her hands rested protectively on her children's heads in a gesture that spoke volumes about the fierce love she bore for these products of a union their world would never accept. The sister Clara had mourned stood before her, transformed by experiences that had carved new paths across her soul just as surely as weapons had marked her face. Gone was the restless girl who had chafed at ranch life and dreamed of adventure beyond the horizon, replaced by a woman who moved with quiet confidence among people who had shown her acceptance without conditions or judgments. When the raid came, I thought I would die in those rocks where I fell," Emma explained while her children pressed closer to her sides. "White Eagle found me there with the wounds that should have killed me, but he carried me to their camp where his grandmother used medicine that our doctors would call savage, but which saved my life when nothing else could have." During the long months of healing that followed, Emma had discovered not just physical recovery, but a different way of existing where her worth wasn't measured by her ability to attract a suitable husband or manage a household according to rigid social rules. White Eagle had sat beside her through fevered nights and helped her relearn to walk when infection had nearly claimed her leg, and somewhere in that patient care love had grown between them like a desert flower that blooms against all odds. Clara saw the contentment in her sister's scarred face and recognized a peace that had always eluded Emma in their previous life, but she also saw the pain of separation and the weight of choices made from necessity rather than desire. The peaceful atmosphere of the hidden camp shattered when a warrior appeared at the valley entrance and moved with urgent purpose toward where Clara sat with Emma beside the cooking fire trying to bridge 7 years of separation with careful words. White Eagle stood tall and lean with the controlled movements of someone accustomed to reading danger in every shift of wind and shadow. And his dark eyes swept over his wife and children before settling on Clara with an intensity that made her understand this was Emma's husband and protector. He spoke rapidly in Apache to Emma, whose face drained of colour as she translated his words for Clara with a voice that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm for the children who sensed the sudden tension. Thornton's vigilantes plan to attack the canyon at dawn with 20 men or more, and they speak of killing any Apache they find and burning out the camps to make the territory safe for white settlers who see enemies in every shadow. The other warriors gathered quickly as word spread through the camp, and Clara could see they were outnumbered 3-1 by the force Thornton was assembling from town men, drunk on fear and old hatred. Emma rose to her feet with the same stubborn set to her jaw that Clara remembered from childhood arguments when her sister would dig in her heels and refuse to budge regardless of consequences or common sense. "We will not run from men like Thornton who use fear to steal what they want because running teaches my children. They don't belong anywhere, and this is their home, where they were born and where they have right to live." White Eagle placed a protective hand on Emma's shoulder, while his eyes never left Clara's face, as if measuring whether this white woman who claimed sisterhood would stand with them or flee to safety of her own kind. "The canyon gives us advantages if we use them wisely," he said, in accented but clear English that surprised Clara, who had assumed language barriers would complicate any cooperation. "Narrow passages where numbers mean nothing and high ground where few can hold against many, but we need every fighter, including those who might stand between rather than behind weapons." Clara understood what he was asking without words as the moment of choice arrived, as with all the weight of consequences that would ripple through the rest of her life whatever decision she made. She could return to town and claim ignorance of the camp's location while maintaining her property and position in a society that would never accept Emma's choices or the children who embodied the mixing of worlds that frontier communities feared above all else. Or she could stand with her sister's adopted family against men she had known all her life and face exile. Or worse, from the only world she had ever known while defending people her culture taught her to see as enemies. The children watched her with solemn eyes that held no understanding of the forces about to descend on their small world, and Clara felt her choice crystallize as she met White Eagle's steady gaze and spoke words that would seal her fate with whatever dawn would bring to the canyon. Clara rode Midnight hard through the darkness, with her heart pounding in rhythm with his hooves, as she raced against time to find some way to prevent the bloodshed that dawn would bring to the canyon. The town lay silent and dark except for lights burning in the saloon, where she knew Thornton would be stoking the fires of hatred, with whiskey and tales of Apache brutality, while carefully avoiding any mention of similar violence committed by white settlers. She guided Midnight to the parsonage where a single lamp glowed in the parlour window, and tied him quickly before climbing the steps to knock with urgency that brought Mrs. Patterson to the door, still dressed despite the late hour. The minister's wife took one look at Clara's face and ushered her inside without the questions that might have come from someone less perceptive about the currents of crisis flowing through their community. "Clara, please sit and tell me what has happened," Mrs. Patterson said while pouring tea with hands that remained steady so despite the worry in her eyes. Without time for delicate approach, Clara explained everything from finding Emma alive in the canyon to the planned vigilante attack that would destroy innocent lives, including her sister's children who bore no responsibility for the sins of either race. Mrs. Patterson listened without interruption until Clara finished, then rose and walked to a small painted portrait on the mantel, showing her eldest son Thomas, who lived in Denver, now practicing law. 7 years ago, my Thomas became lost in a blizzard while hunting and would have died if an Apache hunting party had not found him and carried him to their camp where they nursed him through frostbite that should have cost him his feet. The confession emerged with quiet dignity as she revealed the secret that could have destroyed her husband's ministry if their congregation knew the truth about Apache mercy shown to their child. My husband and I never spoke of it publicly because we were cowards who valued our position more than truth, but I have carried the weight of that silence while listening to people speak of Apaches as nothing but savage killers. Mrs. Patterson moved with sudden purpose to her writing desk where she penned quick notes while speaking with determination that transformed her usual gentle demeanour into something fierce and protective. We will gather the women who have lost too much to violence and are tired of feeding their children to the endless appetite of revenge that consumes both races without distinction. Within an hour, 8 women had gathered in the parsonage parlour, each carrying their own burden of loss from the frontier's brutal arithmetic, where violence begat violence in cycles that seemed eternal. Mrs. Morrison, whose brother died in an Apache raid, but whose nephew was killed by white outlaws, and Mrs. Chen, whose husband was murdered by claim jumpers, and Sarah Williams, who lost her father to army bullets, meant for Apache warriors, all listened as Clara and Mrs. Patterson laid out their desperate plan. These women would place their bodies between the vigilantes and the canyon at dawn, gambling that even men drunk on hatred would hesitate to ride down white women who stood witness to their intended crimes. Dawn broke over Serpent Canyon with ribbons of pink and gold that painted the red rocks in colours that seemed too beautiful for the violence that threatened to stain this ancient place with fresh blood. Clara stood with 11 other women arranged across the narrow canyon entrance where they had positioned 3 wagons as a makeshift barrier, while their horses stamped nervously in the cool morning air that carried the scent of sage and determination. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the vigilantes before they came into view around the bend, and Clara felt her heart hammering as 23 armed men appeared like a dark wave of hatred given form. Jacob Thornton rode at their head on his blood-bay gelding, with his face already flushed with anger at finding his path blocked by women he had expected to be cowering in their homes, while men settled matters of territory and race. His expression darkened to purple rage when he recognized Clara standing at the center of the human barrier with Mrs. Patterson beside her and other respectable townswomen who should have known better than to interfere with necessary work. "Stand aside or be moved," he roared while his horse pranced beneath him, sensing its rider's fury. "You're protecting savages who've stolen white women and murdered innocent settlers, and by God we won't let female sentiment stop us from doing what needs to be done for the safety of our community." The men behind him muttered agreement, though. Clara noticed some seemed uncomfortable with the prospect of riding down women they knew as neighbours, and mothers and wives who had shown them kindness in better times. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with her chin raised, and her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found courage and truth after years of somnolence about her own debt to Apache mercy. "The only thing being stolen here today is justice by men who use fear to take what they want, while wrapping their greed in false righteousness about protecting civilization from dangers they imagine in every shadow." The sheriff arrived just as tensions reached the breaking point where violence seemed inevitable, and Clara saw him assess the situation with the weary eyes of a man who knew this moment would define whether law or mob rule prevailed in their settlement. "Sheriff, arrest these women for obstructing justice," Thornton demanded, while his hand moved toward his sidearm in a gesture meant to remind everyone of the violence he could unleash. Clara knew this was her moment to play the card that would either defuse the situation or trigger bloodshed, and she stepped forward, with her voice carrying clear across the morning air. "Emma Hawkins is alive and living in this canyon as the legal wife of the Apache warrior who saved her life 7 years ago, and her children are American citizens by birth with every right to live free from men who would murder them for the crime of existing." The revelation rippled through the mob like a stone thrown in still water, and at that moment Midnight appeared on the ridge above with White Eagle beside him, making it clear that the Apaches stood ready to defend their families if the vigilantes chose violence over law. The silence that followed Clara's revelation about Emma stretched taut as a bowstring, while the mob processed this information that shattered their righteous certainty about rescuing captive white women from savage kidnappers. Mrs. Patterson chose that moment to step forward with a leather portfolio that she had retrieved during the night from the land office, where her husband's position as minister gave him access to public records that most citizens never bothered to examine. Gentlemen, before you commit acts that cannot be undone in the name of protecting our community. Perhaps you should know that the land you're preparing to attack is legally deeded property belonging to Emma Hawkins by inheritance from her father, she announced, while withdrawing official documents bearing the territorial seal. The supposed worthless canyon scrubland that no one has cared about for decades until Mr. Thornton suddenly developed his passionate concern for removing Apache presence happens to contain mineral rights that belong to a woman you've been told is dead. She held the papers high enough for all to see while continuing with calm precision that cut through Thornton's bluster like a sharp blade through soft leather. These documents filed 7 years ago show that Samuel Hawkins left equal portions of his estate to both daughters, including the canyon property that everyone dismissed as having no value beyond occasional grazing during wet years when grass grew among the rocks. The land office records also show that Mr. Thornton filed mineral claims on adjacent properties just last month, after hiring a surveyor who reported finding traces of silver in the canyon walls that could indicate substantial deposits deeper in the formation. The assembled vigilantes began exchanging glances as the real motivation behind their leaders' sudden concern for community safety became clear as morning light revealing the greed that had been wrapped in patriotic rhetoric about protecting civilization. Several men Clara recognized as decent farmers and shopkeepers who had been swept up in Thornton's fear-mongering began to shift uncomfortably in their saddles as they realized they had nearly become tools for claim jumping disguised as Indian fighting. Tom Morrison lowered his rifle and spoke what others were thinking as the truth settled over them like cold water on hot coals. You told us there were hostile Apaches threatening our families, Jacob, but what you really meant was there were people living on land you wanted to steal for silver mining. The sheriff moved his horse forward with visible relief at having legal grounds to prevent bloodshed, and his voice carried the full weight of territorial law as he addressed the crowd. Any man who sets foot on legally deeded property without permission will be arrested for criminal trespass regardless of who currently resides there, and I'll personally see that federal marshals investigate any attempts to use violence to drive people from their lawful homes. The mob began to disperse with the reluctant movements of men realizing they had nearly committed murder for another man's greed, though Clara could see in some faces that prejudice ran deeper than temporary embarrassment. Thornton's face contorted with rage, but even he recognized that his support had evaporated like morning dew once his true motivation stood exposed in the harsh light of legal documentation that transformed his righteous crusade into common theft, dressed in noble clothing. The weeks following the confrontation at Serpent Canyon brought changes as gradual and persistent as water, wearing away stone as Clara worked to build bridges between two worlds that had existed in mutual fear and misunderstanding for too long. She began by inviting Mrs. Patterson to meet Emma privately at a neutral location halfway between the town and the canyon, where the sisters could talk without the weight of watching eyes from either community. That first meeting was awkward, with long silences and careful words, but Emma's natural warmth and Mrs. Patterson's genuine desire to repay the debt of her son's life gradually thawed the ice of uncertainty. Soon other women joined these gatherings, including Mrs. Chen, whose own experience as an outsider in the predominantly white settlement gave her sympathy for those caught between cultures, and Sarah Williams, who had always questioned the simple narratives of civilization versus savagery that men used to justify violence. Emma brought her children to these meetings, and their bright curiosity proved to be the most effective ambassador for understanding as they chattered in a mixture of Apache and English while playing games that needed no translation. Little Mary Eagle taught Clara Apache words for the natural world around them, like tseku for canyon and to for water, while Clara helped her with English pronunciation in exchanges filled with giggles and patient correction. The boy Joseph Eagle showed a quick mind for numbers and delighted in learning arithmetic from Mrs. Patterson, who had been a schoolteacher before marriage and found joy in teaching again, even in these unconventional circumstances. Some of the bolder townswomen began to see opportunity in trade with the Apache camp as they learned about medicinal herbs and traditional remedies that proved effective for ailments their own doctors struggled to treat. Mrs. Pstubung Morrison, whose arthritis had plagued her for years, found relief in a salve made from desert plants, while her famous apple preserves became highly prized among the Apache women who had limited access to fruit trees. These exchanges happened quietly and carefully, with goods passed through Clara, or left at designated spots to avoid attracting attention from those who would violently oppose any interaction between the communities. Midnight became a familiar sight, travelling between town and canyon with saddlebags carrying letters and small packages, as Emma and Clara worked to maintain their renewed connection, despite the physical distance necessity imposed. The faithful horse seemed to understand his important role, and would wait patiently while messages were written, or packages prepared, never straying from his task, despite temptations of fresh grass or interesting mares. Progress remained fragile as glass, with several townsmen, including Thornton, actively working to undermine any accommodation and spreading poison about race mixing and the corruption of white women's virtue by savage influence. Yet for every voice raised in hatred, there were others who began to question whether the old ways of thinking served any purpose beyond perpetuating cycles of loss that claimed children from both races with equal cruelty. The delicate balance Clara had worked so hard to build between the two communities shattered, like ice in spring when White Eagle emerged from exploring the deeper reaches of Emma's inherited canyon land, with rock samples that glinted with unmistakable threads of silver. He had been marking boundaries and learning the extent of his wife's property when a rockfall exposed a vein of ore so rich that even someone without mining experience could recognize its value as fortune made manifest in stone. The discovery that should have brought joy instead brought dread, as Emma understood that wealth of this magnitude would attract attention from men far more dangerous than Jacob Thornton and his provincial prejudices. Clara immediately contacted a lawyer in the territorial capital who specialized in mining law and had a reputation for both honesty and competence in navigating the complex rules that governed mineral rights and claims in the expanding frontier. Together, they spent days documenting every aspect of Emma's inheritance and establishing clear chains of ownership that traced back to Samuel Hawkins' original land patents and forward through properly witnessed wills that no court could easily dismiss. The lawyer insisted on filing claims not just for the silver discovery, but for the entire canyon system that Emma's inheritance encompassed, to prevent claim jumpers from encroaching on adjacent areas that might connect to the main vein. The news of a major silver strike could not be contained despite their efforts at discretion, and soon reached Jacob Thornton, who saw opportunity to reclaim what his earlier mob action had failed to secure. He retained his own lawyers who crafted arguments that would have been laughable if they weren't so dangerous in their appeal to racial prejudices that infected even supposedly impartial legal systems. Their primary claim rested on the assertion that Emma had abandoned her inheritance and forfeited her rights as a white woman when she chose to live among Apaches and take one as a husband, thereby removing herself from civilized society and its protections. They argued that property rights existed only within the framework of Christian civilization, and that Emma's voluntary departure from that framework constituted legal abandonment regardless of her actual presence on the land or the legitimacy of her marriage under Apache custom. The territorial court scheduled hearings that drew spectators from across the region as word spread of this unprecedented case that touched on every tender nerve of frontier society regarding race and property and the definition of civilization itself. Newspaper reporters arrived from Denver and beyond, drawn by the sensational story of sisters divided by cultural choices, yet united by bonds that transcended social boundaries. They wrote breathless accounts of Clara's daily rides between town and canyon, and Emma's appearance at legal depositions wearing traditional Apache dress, while speaking educated English that confounded stereotypes. The coverage ranged from sympathetic portrayals of family love conquering prejudice to vicious screeds about the corruption of white womanhood, and the dangers of allowing savages to possess wealth that belonged in civilized hands. Through it all, Clara stood beside her sister in courtrooms that reeked of tobacco and hostility, while facing questions designed to shame and diminish them both for refusing to accept the simple categories that frontier society demanded. The territorial courthouse in Phoenix stood like a monument to imposed order, in a landscape that had known different laws for thousands of years before white men drew their arbitrary lines across ancient territories. Judge Harrison Blackwood peered down from his elevated bench with the weight of federal authority behind him, as he delivered a ruling that managed to be both legally correct and morally corrupt in the way only civilized justice could achieve. After reviewing all evidence and testimony presented in the matter of the Hawkins silver claim, this court finds in favor of Emma Hawkins and recognizes her legitimate inheritance rights to the property in question, including all mineral deposits contained therein. The packed courtroom stirred with mixed reactions as Thornton's faction absorbed their defeat while Emma's small group of supporters dared to hope this meant true victory. However, the judge continued with the measured tones of someone about to poison triumph with conditions that revealed the impossible position of those caught between worlds in frontier society. This court must also consider the welfare of minor children who stand to inherit substantial wealth and ensure they receive proper education and guidance to manage such responsibility according to the standards of American civilization. Therefore, the court rules that young Mary Eagle and Joseph Eagle may inherit their portion of the mine proceeds only upon completion of their education at a government Indian school where they will learn the skills necessary to function as productive citizens. Emma's sharp intake of breath cut through the formal atmosphere as she understood the cruel choice being presented between her children's material security and their spiritual destruction in institutions designed to systematically erase every trace of Apache identity. Clara watched her sister's face crumble as the weight of this decision pressed down with all the force of legal precedent that cared nothing for the bonds between mother and child or the violence of severing young souls from their cultural roots. White Eagle's hand found Emma's shoulder in silent support while his dark eyes blazed with the controlled fury of a father watching civilization threaten his children with salvation that looked exactly like destruction. Before the judge could dismiss the court, Clara rose to her feet with an idea forming that might thread the needle between legal requirements and family preservation. Your Honour, if I may propose an alternative arrangement that satisfies the court's concerns while maintaining family bonds essential to the children's well-being, she began while ignoring the hostile murmurs from Thornton's supporters. As Emma Hawkins' sister and a property owner in good standing, I petitioned to become the children's legal guardian for purposes of education and financial oversight, while they continue to reside with their parents who will provide daily care and cultural instruction. The judge leaned forward with interest tinged by skepticism as Clara continued outlining a solution that acknowledged legal realities while protecting what truly mattered. Family doesn't always fit in neat little boxes. Your Honour, and these children deserve to know both sides of their heritage, while preparing for a future that will demand they navigate between worlds with wisdom and strength that comes only from understanding where they belong in both. 1 year after Judge Blackwood's ruling transformed crisis into opportunity, the walls of Serpent Canyon echoed with sounds that would have seemed impossible during those dark days of confrontation and fear. Mrs. Patterson stood before a group of 12 children seated on benches beneath a ramada, built from willow branches and canvas where morning shade made learning possible, despite the desert heat that would build as the day progressed. Mary Eagle helped Tommy Morrison with his Apache pronunciation, while Joseph Eagle and Sarah Williams worked together on arithmetic problems that combined traditional counting methods from both cultures in ways that strengthened an understanding. The school had grown from desperate compromise into something neither community had imagined possible, as parents from town began to see value in their children, learning skills that desert survival had always demanded, but prejudice had forbidden them to acknowledge. 3 days each week focused on traditional academic subjects, while 2 days brought Apache elders to teach plant identification and tracking skills that even the most stubborn townspeople admitted could save lives in harsh country where nature showed no favoritism based on race or creed. The silver mine that had threatened to destroy everything now operated as a cooperative venture, with profits shared between the Apache Band and Town Development Fund that supported the school and brought improvements benefiting all. White Eagle supervised the Apache miners, while Clara managed the business operations, and Emma served as translator and mediator between worlds that grew closer through shared purpose rather than forced assimilation. Some mornings, Clara would find her sister teaching young Apache women to read contracts and calculate percentages, while afternoons might bring Emma to town where she helped establish a medical clinic combining traditional healing with modern medicine. The changes came slowly and not without setbacks as old prejudices died hard and some on both sides resented any accommodation with ancient enemies, but progress could be measured in small victories that accumulated like spring rain filling dry washes. Children who had been taught to fear each other now shared lunches and competed in foot races, where Apache endurance met settler determination in contests that built respect through honest effort. The town cemetery added a section where Apache families could bury their dead according to tradition, while the Sunday school expanded its definition of neighborly love to include those who prayed differently but shared common hopes for their children's future. Midnight grazed peacefully in the canyon meadow that had become neutral ground where both communities gathered for seasonal celebrations that blended traditions in ways that honored rather than erased differences. The faithful stallion, who had started everything with his mysterious journeys, now watched with calm eyes as Mary Eagle braided flowers into his mane, while Tommy Morrison told him stories in improving Apache that made the other children laugh at his pronunciation errors that came from trying rather than mocking. Clara stood with Emma, watching their extended family of choice create something new from the ashes of old hatreds, and realized that Midnight had known something neither sister could have imagined during those first fearful encounters in this canyon, that had become a bridge between worlds once thought destined to remain forever apart.